Kia ora koutou katoa, and again, thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to talk today about our work, and of course equally for the funding to undertake this work as well. So today the plan is to give you an overview of our project. I'm going to focus a little bit on the unique population level data source that we're utilising to undertake this work. And then a brief summary of the results to date and a quick look at the next steps. But first, just a quick introduction of the team on this project. And I won't go through everybody in detail, but I did, I guess, firstly acknowledge it's a newly formed team that we've brought together for this project. And so certainly some of the people on here will be familiar to you all. But part of the value of a grant like this is in bringing a new research team together that crosses multiple disciplines with the hope of future work as well. And I did also want to make particular mention of Keith McLeod, who's here today. Keith's an expert in the use of population level data for research in New Zealand. He's also the person who conceived the idea for this project and has personal connections to MECFS as well. So I'm really grateful that Keith's here today and might put him on the spot for some questions later if I need to. Other people on the project that you'll know, Dr. Ros Vellings, Professor Warren Tate, also Professor Barry Taylor, who's with the Department of Women's and Children's Health at the University of Otago, and then two emerging researchers, Fran Ann's PhD candidate up at the University of Auckland, and Hien Vu, who's also with us here at the Department of Women's and Children's Health at University of Otago. So in terms of the background of the project, I don't plan on saying terribly much here other than to acknowledge some of the amazing research and knowledge that's been built up on MECFS in New Zealand. But for the purposes of this project, at least, the big gap in evidence is around a lack of use of population level data for MECFS research. And that's the case both in New Zealand, but also to some extent internationally as well. So with that in mind, the objectives of this study were to use routinely collected population level data and to use that to describe the socio-demographic and health characteristics of a working age MECFS population in New Zealand who are receiving a health or disability related income tested benefit. And so just to sort of acknowledge and address this first point up front, the reason why we chose to look at this particular group of people is that it's the only group with MECFS in New Zealand where their diagnosis information is systematically collected in population level data. So it does mean that this is not a group that is representative of the wider MECFS population. And I guess, for the sake of research, it's really important to acknowledge this up front and be transparent about it, particularly when it comes to interpreting some of the results. But it's still a very relevant population and one that we can learn a lot about. And so to this end, the second objective of the research is to explore the health service use, labour market outcomes, and social service use of this MECFS population compared to a population without MECFS, but is also receiving a health or disability related income tested benefit in New Zealand, and then the rest of the New Zealand general population. So the research database that I've been referring to so far is called the Integrated Data Infrastructure, or IDI for short. So the sort of one-liner for this is that it's a research database that's managed by Stats New Zealand, and it contains linked, de-identified data on people and households for everyone that's ever been resident in New Zealand. What this really means is that for everyone in New Zealand, data is collected by a range of organisations, and they're mostly government agencies. And those data on individuals have all been compiled into one place by Stats New Zealand and have been made available for research, which is deemed to be for the public good. So one important aspect is that they are data on everybody in New Zealand, and the other is that that the data have been linked at an individual level by Stats New Zealand. And so you're able to look at somebody's health information in relation to their social service use, for example, or their tax records in relation to their education attainment. And so it's this combination of factors of population level data across multiple life domains that do make it, the IDI, a world-leading resource for research. So the figure there just gives you a bit more of an idea about the breadth of content within the IDI. It contains information, as I said, from health, education, the population census, taxation, social services, the justice system, child protection, social housing. There's even address history information, and also information from customs about border movements. The notable absence here, and particularly relevant for this study, is that there are no data from primary care. And the main reason for that is that information at the primary care level isn't systematically collected at a national level. And so that's one of the main reasons why we chose the population we did, because we don't have access to that diagnosis information in primary care. Another couple of quick things that I did want to mention about the data set. It obviously contains some highly confidential information about individuals. And so there are a lot of policies and protocols in place to ensure that the data are kept safe. So one important thing is that as researchers, firstly, we need to be approved by the government statistician to access the data. A particular project needs to also be approved to access the data. And then when we do access it, we're accessing these data through a remote server through to Stats New Zealand, who hold the data. So as researchers, we never hold this information on our own computers. And then on top of that, there are a range of policies and protocols to ensure anonymity of the data. And in particular, I guess it's important to point out that as researchers, we're not, even though we have access to individual level data, we're not interested in any one person's information. We're interested in aggregate information on particular groups of interest. So what we've done for this study is we've created a cohort of all people aged 16 to 64 years in New Zealand in the estimated resident population for the 21-22 year. So that is essentially everybody that's alive and living in New Zealand at 30th of June, 2022. And so from that, we then identify an ME/CFS population from Ministry of Social Development data as anyone receiving a health or disability related benefit with a primary or secondary diagnosis code for ME/CFS. And then the two comparison groups, who are also both drawn from that overall ERP cohort, anybody who's receiving an MSD health or disability related benefit but without an ME/CFS code on their record, and then finally the rest of the non-MSD New Zealand population. And as I mentioned, we have a range of outcomes of interest, but they essentially cross four domains of health, education, labour market, and social services. So within health, we're interested in co-occurring conditions that are listed on the MSD records. And we're also interested in health service utilisation, and in particular, emergency department presentations, inpatient hospitalisations, and pharmaceutical use. Within education, we utilise census data and information from the Ministry of Education to capture qualifications obtained, as well as current study participation. From the labour market, we use Inland Revenue Department taxation data to identify people who are currently employed and then people who have had wages and salary within the last year. And then finally, social service information from MSD, looking at a range of benefit use. So the total cohort of the estimated resident population of 16 to 64-year-olds is just over 3 million people. And then from among those, 1,842 who are identified through MSD data with a ME/CFS diagnosis code. So And so obviously, I guess, depending on what prevalence estimate you're comfortable with for MECFS, it certainly represents a substantially smaller number than the true population. And so, as mentioned, we are looking at a particular subpopulation of that overall MECFS population, and roughly speaking, perhaps capturing 10% or fewer of that population. The other MSD population, so those without an MECFS diagnosis, there are just over 120,000 people there, and then the remainder in that general population comparison group. So this is a first table of results showing socio-demographic characteristics of those three populations. And I really just wanted to touch on two particular points here. The first is to highlight the sex distribution of the MECFS population, and here shows that roughly 7 out of 10 are female, and so that's largely, I guess, consistent with what we would expect. The second thing is around the ethnic distribution of these populations, and in particular, the high numbers of Europeans in the MECFS population and the low number of Māori. And they are high and low respectively, both in relation to the non-benefit population, but as well as the other MSD population. But it's that comparison to the other MSD population that was a little bit surprising to us. It's certainly unusual from a benefit population perspective to have that ethnic distribution. This table shows some other socioeconomic characteristics of the populations, including area level deprivation and also highest qualifications obtained. So the first thing here, I think, to highlight is the MECFS population on average is living in areas in less deprived areas compared to the other MSD populations. So for example, we have 20% of the MECFS population living in the most deprived areas of New Zealand, compared to pretty much double that at almost 40% among the other MSD population. And then consistent with that is that on average, the MECFS population has much higher levels of education attainment. So substantially lower numbers of people without any qualifications compared to the other MSD population, and much higher levels of those with any tertiary level qualification. This slide shows the co-occurring conditions that are noted in the MSD benefit records of the MECFS population. So key things to highlight here firstly are that 62% of that population have at least one co-occurring condition noted on their record. And then among those on the right-hand side of this figure are listed sort of, I guess, the umbrella categories or the chapters that these conditions sit under. So we can see that about 40% are related to mental health conditions, and then 20% musculoskeletal. So if we drill down a little bit deeper into those diagnosis codes, this table shows the top 10 codes. And again, so we see that mental health is really common here, but they're predominantly around anxiety and depression. And then the other notable diagnosis here being the top one on the list, fibromyalgia, which I guess is interesting given the notable similarities and discussion around overlap with MECFS. So this slide shows study participation rates across the three groups of interest, and then it's partitioned by part and full-time study in blue and orange respectively. So the figure shows substantially lower rates of study participation compared to the general population, but higher rates for the MECFS population compared to that other benefit group. And then within those that are studying, I think quite interestingly, much higher proportions of those studying part-time within the MECFS population, which is probably consistent with what we would expect. In terms of employment, this figure shows rates of current employment in blue, and then any labour market income in the last year in orange across the three groups. it shows fairly similar levels of employment rates between the two MSD groups, but obviously much lower rates of employment compared to the general population. This figure here shows the health and disability benefit groups that the ME/CFS group and the other MSD population are on, and shows the ME/CFS group are more likely to be on the supported living payment. And I guess another thing that we're not showing here in this figure, but we've also explored benefits across the last 5 years. And interesting to note that half of the ME/CFS population have been on the benefit for all of that period, demonstrating that ongoing long-term nature of the condition. The figure here shows other benefit payments received in the last year. So a couple of things to highlight. I think there in the middle, we see much higher take-up of the disability allowance for the ME/CFS group in blue compared to the other MSD group. And then looking to the right-hand side of the figure, substantially lower take-up of emergency payments or special needs grants, which are those extreme hardship grants. And so again, perhaps consistent with the relative socioeconomic characteristics of the ME/CFS group compared to the other MSD group. Last 3 slides are around health service utilisation. So this is showing eligibility for disability support services and access to DSS in the last year. And the takeaway here, I guess, is very low take-up rates of DSS among the ME/CFS group, consistent with ME/CFS not meeting current DSS eligibility criteria. Higher DSS access and use among the other MSD group, but obviously still quite low overall. In terms of ED presentations and hospitalizations, ED here in blue and hospitalizations in orange, we can see higher rates of both ED and inpatient hospitalizations compared to the general population, but lower, a little bit lower compared to the other MSD population, certainly quite a lot lower in terms of hospitalizations. And then the final slide, a lot of data here, so bear with me. The final figure shows rates of pharmaceutical use over the last year, and this is broken down by the number of unique pharmaceuticals dispensed in that year. So gives some sense of polypharmacy in these populations as well. So overall, what this figure shows is quite similar pharmaceutical use between the ME/CFS group and the other MSD group, but both of those two groups having much higher rates of pharmaceutical use compared to the general population. So for example, if you look to the left-hand side of this figure, it shows much lower rates of those receiving no medication during the year compared to the general population. But then on the far right-hand side, much higher rates of those using 10 or more medications in the year, which is, I guess, some measure of extreme polypharmacy and over twice the rates compared to the general population. So for us as a team, in terms of next steps, the next big piece of work is to get interpretation of findings from key stakeholders. So lived experience, input into the interpretation of these findings, and then also the clinical perspectives from the members of the research team. There's a little bit more work to go in terms of statistical analysis, where we'll do some adjustment for some of the socio-demographic factors just to ensure like-for-like comparisons. And then the plan ultimately for dissemination of this work will be an academic manuscript that we'll write up for publication, which will be open access, and then a 2-page lay summary for community-based dissemination. And then we'd had a sort of a quick chat about future work as well. And going back to the initial point that we're looking here at a specific subgroup of the ME/CFS population, we think there's potential to look broader than that benefit population, and the potential to harness some of the work that's being recently funded, which is looking to create an ME/CFS registry. And so if that is developed, and if that can then be linked to the IDI, then there's potential to then look at the wider ME/CFS population. So that's all from me. I have to just show this disclaimer, and also I'll pop my email up there. Welcome any contact from anybody if you have any questions or thoughts around what we've done, and happy to take some questions.
That's great. Thank you very much, Nick. It was a thorough update on your research, and I think it's actually really very helpful for us to see this data and how it's aligning with our understanding of the ME community and what they're going through, and services that they utilize. So thank you. So I'm just going to open up for questions. And Gabby.
Hi, thanks so much, Nick. That was a very interesting talk, and exciting to hear about how the studies go on over the past year. I just had a question on how you would plan to match your socioeconomic population, because it's quite striking the difference that you've found. Would you plan for the analysis to be, was it the 1,800 participants, and match those directly for a similar participant, or would you, how would you plan on doing that for your stats analysis?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are a range of options, obviously, that we can go with. Our thinking at the moment is what's called a propensity score matching approach. And so with the data that we have, we can match all of those 180 people in the 1,800 people in the ME/CFS group to perhaps 10 people in each of the comparison groups based on socio-demographic characteristics. So I think what we would initially look to do is match on the socio-demographic characteristics that I showed in the first slide, which would be age, sex, and ethnicity, and perhaps do an analysis just based on matching on those characteristics, but then could potentially look to match on area level deprivation as well. I guess the complication there is what comes is the causal sort of pathway of the differential in area level deprivation, and do you want to match on a characteristic that might be the result of a condition rather than something that precedes it? But that's the planned approach is a matching approach.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting to see that data once you've got it, because I imagine they would probably impact some of the outcomes that you were looking at hugely. So that'll be quite interesting to see.
Yeah, completely agree. Yeah, thank you.
I also think, actually, just thinking about that, it would be interesting to see, to compare. So what the level is preceding the illness, and then what it becomes during the illness. So if the deprivation level does increase during the illness, that would be an interesting picture to show, I think. Because we know that a lot of people are unable to be in employment once they become ill. So it makes sense. So being able to show that graphically would be interesting. Are there any other questions for Nick or Keith? Or Keith, are you wanting to?
I was just going to say that unfortunately we don't have a very good indication of onset date. That we know when someone comes on to benefit, so we could get some information. We could adjust for time on benefit or something. But yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah.
I have
any other questions?
Oh, sorry, was that
Wendy?
Yeah.
Gabby? Yeah. Oh, Wendy.
Yes. Sorry, me. Okay.
Yes, Wendy, go for
it. Thank you. That was fascinating. My query too would be, it would be very interesting to look at the anxiety, depression, PTSD scores before the illness and after, because the problem we have with that is that when those are so very high, we can easily be put in under the functional neurological disorders and other things as well. So it would be, I think, quite interesting to be able to show whether or not the the deprivation had affected that, or the lack of access to services, all that sort of thing. I think could be quite interesting around all of that. But that was fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I think the hope is that a piece of work like this, we acknowledge that it's at a really high level and on a particular group, but it does hopefully prompt some of those questions and future research in that space to look at some of those more nuanced questions that you've raised today.
I just had one other question, and it's it's such a shame that the ADI databases that you have don't have primary care information in them for that health utilisation. Is there any way that you could dive further into examining health utilisation other than hospitalizations and ED admissions? Because that's kind of not necessarily where I would see the ME/CSF population having that high rate of health utilisation.
Yeah, I totally agree. And so the one way that it could be done is to not use the IDI and to use a bespoke linkage collection within health. So my understanding is that primary care data isn't going to be put into the IDI anytime soon. There was a program of work to do it, and it's been halted. But there is good primary care data that's been collected around the country, and some of those are collected in systematic ways. So you could, for example, take WellSouth data from down here, ProCare from Auckland, and use those primary care data, and then it's not that difficult to get the Ministry of Health to link other national collections of health service utilisation. So you could get a more nuanced look at the health services, but it would also enable potentially the identification of a broader ME/CFS population through their primary care diagnosis information as well. I don't know, Keith, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, it's a difficult one, but unfortunately, I mean, it would be great if we had more data recorded. And one of the things I think that this can highlight is the lack of data. There's so many things that we can do with the IDI because things are being recorded around mental health services or around people who are seen in hospital contexts, and it just highlights the invisible nature of ME/CFS, that we just can't identify this population at the moment.
Hopefully a cool future project then.
Yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. So I was just wondering, how do you go about interpreting the results through lived experience? Are you recruiting, or are you going to select people?
Yeah, we'll just be selecting. There's a time frame issue, as well as our ability to remunerate people for their time. So that's the next steps, and I'll certainly be in touch with you, Fiona, about that again. But it is, this is the first project I've done in this space, but I've done quite a lot of research projects using the IDI, and the real focus is always to get community input to interpret the results, because it's, obviously they're the people that know the most about these experiences. So that'll be a priority for the next steps, and then balance that with the clinical perspectives on the team as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Is there anything else that you'd want to share, Keith?
Nothing I can think of right now, no.
Okay, no, that's fine. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you both coming along today and giving us this talk. And I think it's a really good first step to just understanding that picture of what is captured and what isn't. And then so identifying those gaps of where we could potentially try and find new information as well. But it'll be really interesting to see the interpretation and your clinical perspectives coming out as well. So thank you very much. Look forward to that.